This week on Act Out, try as we might, we cannot hide from climate change. And now, thanks to a legally binding UN resolution, the US can't actually hide from its heaps of trash. Next up, media literacy is a vital skill set. Indeed, it shapes how we see every other issue. And now there may actually be a way to build media literacy and hold journalists accountable by taking a page from Yelp and Rotten Tomatoes. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out.
Brigade! Bulldozers swarm outside the checkpoint gate. A Norwich flash broke the hush and blew me into the street. I walk next to the body of my baby. No!
Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. I give the UN a lot of shit, deservedly. Be it the fact that they pass non-binding resolutions that end up meaning about as much as hopes and prayers, or the fact that they commit war crimes in places like Haiti, I have to say that I'm not a huge fan. That being said, I do have to hand it to them when they do something right. Like last week when they hosted a press conference on the situation inside the Venezuelan embassy that was later raided, or when they accused Israel of war crimes, or indeed on May 10th when they announced that 186 countries had reached a legally binding agreement to cut plastic pollution. Now, for those of you seeing that headline on the screen, you know where I'm headed next. Oh yes. For as much as I side-eye the UN for their pitfalls, they are nothing compared to the painfully backwards and bumbling US empire. The US stood alone on its city upon a hill of plastic waste, while countries signed on to add plastics to the Basel Convention, a treaty that regulates movement of hazardous materials from one country to another, thereby acknowledging the dangers of ever-growing hazardous plastic pollution. Not so side note, if you haven't already, please do watch or listen our interview with Stephen Feit from the Center for International Environmental Law, whom we interviewed in episode 208. So as the Basel Convention focuses on hazardous materials going into developing nations, this amendment likewise highlights the trend of rich nations sending all of their plastic shit to smaller, poorer nations that basically have become garbage dumps for the likes of the United States. And as we've covered on this show, for a variety of reasons, China closed the recycling bin on us, so to speak, forcing the US to find other places to dump the trash. And we're not ones to pick up after ourselves, so we looked for the smaller kids on the playground to bully into cleaning up our messes. Of course, the problem, among others, is that due to lack of anywhere near the kind of infrastructure you need to handle our mounds of shit, these countries are now drowning in heaps of plastic. So this latest amendment is an important step forwards. And although the US is neither part of the original Basel Convention nor agreed with this common sense plastics amendment, we too will have to reckon with it. The US and other countries now will not be able to send the plastic waste to developing countries that are part of the Basel Convention and are not part of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Thanks to the powerful work of activists around the world, this is a very public and globally reverberating move towards actively addressing our shithousing of the planet. It's also a reminder that we cannot expect our government to step up and do what's right. The US government will not do on its own what is necessary to save humanity from the coming climate catastrophes. It won't even save us from the ones that we're already experiencing now. So, do raise your glass to this step, but know that further steps are necessary and only possible when we stand up on the front lines. Moving on, media literacy is an incredibly important issue. Indeed, it is in many ways the gatekeeper to all other issues, shaping our understanding of what's really happening in our own backyards and around the globe. But it's hard. It goes beyond just smelling the rank bullshit in, for instance, this report by CNN that claimed there were elections in Venezuela in January in which voters chose Guaido, when in fact, Mike Pence chose Guaido, who then later announced his chosen boy status to a country where almost 90% of the population had never heard of him, and even as he told his own opposition party members. Most just kind of slowly backed off the stage as if to say, you know what, this shit's crazy, I'm out. Another loud and proud example of corporate media dumbshittedness, a recent Media Matters report found that for every day for the first 4 months of 2019, Fox News didn't have one day, not one day, of telling the truth. You gotta hand it to them, though. No days off. That's commitment. So, of course, those are the more overt missteps, the kind of low-hanging fruit of media literacy. Important, but be careful lest you underestimate the insidious nature of the propaganda machine. Because it goes deeper than that. The fact that, for instance, we talk about the Maduro regime, but the Macron presidency. They're both presidents. Your skin color dictates whether media will refer to you as a criminal or a suspect, a terrorist or a lone gunman, a mental health case or a bad egg. Men are forceful, women are emotional, socialism bad, capitalism good, you get the point. People gloss over these words without really thinking, without questioning, and before you know it, that regime must be toppled. That president must be respected. That cop had to shoot that thug. That woman couldn't possibly be telling the truth about her rape. There are Machiavellian and tiny, tiny gears at work in this machine, and it takes a lot of work to figure out what lies behind the neat and tidy headlines, what's just beyond that video frame. And it's easy to let your guard down. Even with this show, it's important to recognize what you're getting. I take my work very seriously, and I research these stories to make sure what I tell you is factually accurate, but I'm sure as shit opinionated. Mine is not a show that claims to be neutral in the face of growing fascism, a global homicidal empire and the sixth great extinction. I will not give you everyone's angle on a story, because I know the earth isn't flat. I know women deserve human rights. I know climate change is real. And because I do not welcome fascists, bigots, science deniers, theocrats, sexist, racist, asshats, or those who don't believe in basic human rights onto this show. That's the show. Take it or leave it. Just know what you're taking or leaving. And that's media literacy, of course. Knowing what you're consuming. Like looking at the ingredients list on a package. Of course, with media, that looking at the ingredients is more time-consuming and difficult. And it often feels like a lonely frontier of second-guessing and deep dives into the back pages of Google searches. But what if there were an easier way? What if amidst the din of cat videos and infotainment, there were actually a place where you could go to see legit reviews and ratings of news? Like a Rotten Tomatoes for this real-world stage and its actors. So Credder might be that place. And last week we sat down with Credder CEO and co-founder Chase Palmieri to talk about this new venture that's launching next week, and how it seeks to boost media literacy and hold journalists and outlets accountable for what they peddle. Take a look.
I guess I would start with the high-level mission of the company, which is to accelerate the news industry's transition from an economy of clicks to an economy of credibility. We see the attention-driven revenue models as a problem, aligning the interests of news producers and news consumers. And my friends and I that eventually became the co-founders of Credder, we were just your regular frustrated, avid news consumers, and we were very unhappy with the other solutions being proposed in the space, which were at the time, and still are to some extent, let's let Google and Facebook censor on our behalf. Or an AI for news will come and save the day. And I have a background in entrepreneurship, and as a business operator, I have a restaurant here in Petaluma, California. And I saw how when Yelp came into the restaurant industry, it allowed customers to hold restaurants accountable and leave their feedback, and kind of allowed restaurant goers to connect in real time and work together. And we think that the same solution is what's needed for news consumers. Because right now, when you see an article that's, for whatever reason, not credible, it just doesn't gain your trust, or it's clickbaity or sensationalist, what your average news consumer does today is just exits out of the tab. And we see that as a missed opportunity, because they could be pointing out the problem to the next reader or providing helpful feedback to the authors and outlets themselves so that they can actually improve their ability to build a trusted audience.
So, with regards to the peer-reviewed aspect, unlike Yelp, a bit more like Rotten Tomatoes or something, you have the sort of expert, as in like a movie critic, and then you
Yeah.
also have like the regular audience. So you on Credder you have like the journalists that are reviewing, and then also readers who aren't journalists. Talk a little bit about that difference between those reviewers.
Yeah, that was really important to us that we highlight journalists in their own category because they have a track record, they are paid professionals, and so we want to make them happy to a certain extent and let them have their kind of their own rating category. And then you have your audience category, like you said. And the reason to have the difference is the journalist category, those are verified journalists that we have verified their identity on our end. And the average news consumers, we want to get to real identity, but at the end of the day, that is an open category for any news consumer to come review articles within. And so the idea is, look, if you, and we can get, I'm sure we'll get into this, but if you think that the user category is all Russian bots and trolls, well, then fine, you can at least see what other journalists are saying about these articles. And a big reason why we position ourselves as the Yelp or Rotten Tomatoes for news is also because our very first advisor is Patrick Lee, the founder and former CEO of Rotten Tomatoes, and so he was a big part of guiding our model.
So, so something that I also wanted to get into is that journalism tends to pedestal the idea of being non-biased, right? But you could argue that there's no such thing as non-biased reporting. And I, for instance, will be very open that my work as a journalist focuses on activating people for the sake of justice movements around the world. That's not unbiased, but it's also not untrue. So I don't report on something like I don't report on I don't lie in my reporting in order to activate people. I might
Right.
say, climate change is a thing, therefore you should activate. That's not false, but it's also not unbiased. How do you weigh those differences?
Yeah, so the first 8 months of our company, before it was even a company, it was more of an experiment. We were trying to come up with what would be a review process for news. Because a simple 5-star subjective rating doesn't really do anything for your fellow news consumer, doesn't do anything for the author. And so we spent a lot of our time working with media literacy professionals and consultants and just iterating on this process of a review process for news. And what we came away with is that we are not a fact-checking site. What we are doing is we're gathering and collecting news consumers' trust in any given article, author, or outlet. So, for example, if you're transparent about your kind of agenda to activate people to start solving some of these problems, and you're not hiding it or obscuring it in any way, you might still build trust from even climate denier audiences because you're at least being transparent in your reporting. And so that's really what we're doing is we're providing a platform to finally capture news consumers' feedback, create this collective memory of news consumers, and have a sense of who trusts what articles, authors, and outlets, and if they don't trust it, exactly why they don't trust it.
And you also bring up a good point that there's a difference between the outlet and the writer. Talk about how that rating system differentiates between those two.
Yeah, this is hugely important to Credder's mission because we see the future of journalism being much more entrepreneurial, much more about freelance journalists or journalists that are supported directly by their audience and don't even necessarily need to work under a brand outlet. So to us, the idea of creating this public rating page or this online reputation for the authors is hugely important because right now authors get their little black and white byline on their when they publish a piece for an outlet, and the outlet is actually capturing all of that trust, all of that name recognition, and then the authors go off and they have no way of building their audience or letting them follow them or taking their reputation with them or the trust that they built. And so, yeah, based on the way we see the future of news being, where anybody can write anything and hit publish and be supported by their readers, it's important that these people that are hitting publish on the articles have a way of demonstrating their track record and their credibility to their readers.
Talk about how, because thinking about Yelp, I mean, I agree. I think Yelp is great and I absolutely use it to decide whether I'm going to go somewhere. But there can also be those reviews that say, like, I didn't like where their bathroom was or something ridiculous like that, where you're like, that's not really a valid complaint. Talk about how you could possibly, or how you are addressing reviews that might be totally vapid or might be personally based on not liking that person or et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and that's why it's important that we don't allow people to directly review the authors or the outlets. Anybody on the site is only ever reviewing the article based on its content. And so what you're doing when you're reviewing is you're either saying, I trust this article, or I don't trust this article. And if you say you don't trust it, you have to select a very specific reason why you don't trust it. And the purpose for that is that not only are you warning the next reader and providing specific feedback for the author of the article, but your review is now something that can be up and down voted by the rest of the community. So what we do is we say, okay, was this review helpful? If so, it gets upvoted. If not, it gets downvoted. And so based on the helpfulness of all of your reviews on the platform, it actually creates your own user rating. So the reviewers on our platform themselves are also held accountable. And that will eventually tie into the weighting of everyone's reviews.
So your review is reviewed, essentially.
Exactly. Yeah, kind of like a Stack Overflow model or a Quora where you can up and down vote the helpful responses.
So I guess the other question is, how do people, because a lot of people will get their news from Twitter or Facebook or some other social media platform, as opposed to, going to CNN.com or hopefully not, but something like truthdig.com. But how would people know to go to Credder, for instance? Obviously, the idea is that word of mouth or social media will get people to know that, but how can people access Credder as opposed to just going to an outlet?
Yes, this is a great point, and this was the kind of early wall that we ran into when we were pitching, this and trying to onboard users. What we came to understand is that for a lot of the news consumers, the most helpful version of Credder is actually going to be an extension, a browser extension. And so for users or listeners of your audience that aren't aware of browser extensions, basically all it means is you would be able to come to Credder, download an extension that is attached to your Chrome browser or your Firefox browser. And then let's say you go to Facebook and Twitter or YouTube, wherever you get your news. When you click and you land on an article or an author or an outlet, if we do a quick search of our database, and if we have some rating information to show you, that'll pop up as a little notification to kind of warn you what you just landed on. And then when you get to the bottom of the article, we'll actually slide it out again to prompt you to go ahead and review the article. And what's interesting about this is not only are we providing the value of Credder to you when you need it most, but it's also helpful to Credder because if you look at platforms like Yelp and Rotten Tomatoes, it's only about 1% of their user base that's actually leaving the reviews. And that's in large part because you're taking an offline experience and then reviewing it online, right? So you go to a restaurant, you have your experience, then you have to go home, pull up the laptop and write your review. Same thing, you go to the movie theater, watch a movie, then you pull up Rotten Tomatoes to write your review. What we want to do is hopefully get to a percentage of more like 5 or 10% of our users are actually leaving feedback. And that's going to happen with the extension.
So talk a little bit about, because obviously with the launch, then you have to get the ball rolling with regards to the platform. When people go onto Credder's site once it launches, what will they be seeing in terms of like where are you pulling the articles from? So what's kind of a cross section of what they might see on that homepage?
You would see just about any article from any outlet, definitely a lot from smaller independent outlets, and anybody can post any URL of any article at any time. The beauty of what Credder is doing in regards to which articles are on the platform is that we actually aren't fighting the same battles that Facebook and Twitter are fighting, where they're kind of playing whack-a-mole censorship, trying to combat the idea of, not so credible articles or the fake news. But the battle, we're not fighting that battle because we would want the very worst articles to end up on our platform so that they can be rated. In the same way that Rotten Tomatoes would want the worst movies to be on Rotten Tomatoes so that it could be rated and actually serve as a warning to the news consumers.
So that brings up an interesting point, is that let's say that you end up having a lot of, I mean, I'm just using this as an example because he popped into my head. I don't even think he writes articles, but let's say Alex Jones wrote articles, um, and there was just a wash with Alex Jones articles on Credder. Is there some sort of algorithm that says like, oh, we're getting a lot of stuff just from this one person, let's mix it up? Like, is there something like that that gives people a good blend, or is it possible for one outlet or one journalist to kind of flood the page?
If we're doing our job well and reaching out to multiple publishers and getting their readers involved, then that shouldn't happen. There shouldn't be any kind of takeover. But the way it is set up now is that the articles that are getting the most reviews on our platform come to the homepage. Whether they're getting reviewed negatively or positively, the more reviews they're getting, that means the more people are actively interested in that article at that time. And so it does get more attention on the homepage. I envision us having to at some point tweak how we display which articles on the homepage more, but at this time that's what we're doing.
And talk about some of the, and full disclosure, I am one of them. Talk about some of the journalists that you have included there, not just in terms of their work, but in terms of the journalist reviewers.
Yeah, so we have, thank you for being one of them. We have about 300 journalists on the platform right now, reviewing under the critic category. And this is actually why we haven't been open to the public. We've been invite only for journalists. We've tested the product extensively with your average news consumer, but we wanted to make sure that we were providing the tools and kind of all the incentives to make sure that journalists participate in this, because it's important to us that we have their credible reviews next to all the, regular news consumer reviews. And so one of the ways we're doing that is by featuring their Twitter handles next to their reviews, so that when they write a lovely, helpful review about whatever the issue or article is, it can be a way to actually drive their own follower base. So we're always working on ways to incentivize journalists to participate. We have 300 journalists on the platform and a couple thousand users on the platform. And the reason we're just now launching to the public is we wanted to make sure that we had enough reviews in both of those categories to actually have a significant number of authors and outlets with early ratings before we opened it up.
Right, because otherwise you get to the page and nothing's rated, and you're like, what am I looking at?
Yeah, pretty anticlimactic.
Right, yeah. Has there been any response from outlets that got negative reviews, like any retraction or any commentary?
Not so much yet, but again, we are a little hard to find at the moment because we're behind that wall. It will be interesting to see, though. So, for example, one thing that we've noticed, one of the early findings is that the New York Times has about a 91% rating from journalists, but only a 65% rating from your average news consumer. So this is really starting to get interesting. We're starting to see which outlets the journalist community trusts the most and which ones are actually not building the most trust with the actual core readers. So these are some of the findings that will be controversial, especially when we launch publicly and anybody can reference these pages and share them around social media. But at this time, the journalists and the outlets that think they're doing a good job are actually embracing Credder because it's a way they feel they don't have to compete with clickbaity headlines from other outlets anymore. They might actually be able to just focus on the work they're doing and be rewarded with traffic and revenue based on the quality of their work.
It's also disappointing to hear that New York Times got a 91 from fellow journalists, but that also speaks to the point that, I mean, every now and then it's like the blind squirrel. The New York Times finds the truth, like fumbling in the dark. So it also speaks to the importance of differentiating between the journalists and the outlet, because, incredible journalists like Glenn Greenwald or what have you have written articles that have appeared in the New York Times and the Washington Post, and they shouldn't be judged based on the shittiness of the outlet where their work appeared.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We have an author leaderboard and an outlet leaderboard, but really the goal is so that we stop looking to the outlets and start looking directly at the journalists and their track record of, really putting out the work on behalf of readers and building a trusted audience. So yeah, giving those authors a way to have their own brand, their own online reputations outside of the outlet.
And of course, you mentioned before media literacy, and the importance of media literacy is, of course, to extract ourselves from, those big six companies that own basically 99% of media or whatever it is, and really look at the stories and the realities that exist outside of what corporate media is having us believe, and understand that they are not the peddlers of truth, but rather more often the peddlers of propaganda, and you have to look beyond that. So,
Yeah, to that, I guess I would say we think of ourselves as the first media literacy tool that can actually be put in the hands of news consumers and kind of connect news consumers in real time. Because back to the example I mentioned at the beginning, media literacy has typically been kind of a lonely skill set, right? It's something obviously you care a lot about, I care a lot about, but when we go about our news consuming and we use our media literacy skills, we still hit X out of that article, and we've done nothing to kind of allow our skill to go and help protect the next person. And we've done nothing to allow the skill to, alert the author that they could have done better or that they lost your trust for this reason. So it's really just about giving news consumers a voice and giving the consumers of an industry finally a way to hold the producers of an industry accountable.
So starting this coming Monday, May 27th, you'll be able to review, rate, and play an active role in building media literacy. Head to Credder.com to get signed up, and that will do it for this week's Dose of Dissent. Thank you so much for watching. Reminder, the best way to stay up to date on our work is to sign up for the newsletter at the address below. To those who have donated to keep the show going, thank you so much. Please keep spreading the word in order to ensure our ability to keep acting out. From the Devil's Den, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, visit patreon.com/actout.
I can hear the boots are stomping. Come on, boys, let's get some rocks to throw. I can't stand to hear my father cry anymore. Time we left one of you motherfuckers dead in the road. We've been begging up inch by inch, we got nowhere else to go. It's been too many years since you pushed and served my shove. I'm not a violent man, but I'm